The hum of the Ardmore Harbor 911 dispatch center is a sound you never get used to. It's not loud, just a constant, low-grade thrum of electricity and anxiety, the collective heartbeat of a city having its worst night. Every night for 3 months. I'd been an intern on the graveyard shift, learning the rhythms of catastrophe. I'd learned to keep my voice a flat, calm plain in the face of roaring fires and silent, open-line standoffs. I thought I'd learned how to handle pressure. I was wrong. My phone buzzed against the cool laminate of my console, a forbidden vibration in a room where personal calls were the enemy of focus. I glanced down. It wasn't my foster mom checking in. It was a number I didn't have saved, but I knew who it was from. Shoreline Servicers Last Chance. North. The call logs for the West End District. Tonight, or your student loan default becomes the least of your problems. My blood went cold, a familiar, sickening plunge. It had started 2 weeks ago. A polite request from a man who claimed to be a private investigator, asking for specific 911 call data. I refused, citing protocol. The requests became demands. The demands became threats. They knew where I lived. They knew I was an intern. Disposable. They knew my Social Security number was flagged from a student loan I was desperately trying to defer. They wanted the call logs, and they didn't care how they got them. Problems. Northmark, a senior dispatcher with a face like a worn-out catcher's mitt, smirked from across the room. He saw the look on my face. They all did. In the predatory boredom of the midnight shift, my quiet terror had become the floor's favorite show. He slid a crumpled Post-it note across the floor with the toe of his boot. It skittered to a stop by my chair. On it, scrawled in thick black marker, was a 10-digit number. The number. The one they've been passing around for a week, a cruel joke at my expense. Feeling lucky, another one, Sarah called out, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. They say he's the West Coast's own private 911. One call, all your problems disappear. Or you disappear with them. That was the other part of the story. The number belonged to a ghost, a legend whispered about in the city's dark corners. Dorian Lazaro. His name never appeared in the news, but the name of his company, Alderstone Holdings, was everywhere etched onto the sides of construction cranes, reshaping the skyline, on the plaques of charitable foundations, on the hulls of the sleek, quiet ships that slipped in and out of the harbor. He was a pillar of the community on paper, in whispers. He was the final word on anything that mattered west of the Rockies. He was the man you called when God didn't answer. My phone buzzed again, a notification from my banking app. Your account has been frozen due to a creditor's lien. My breath hitched. That was my rent money, my grocery money, everything. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I gripped the edge of my desk, the sharp corner digging into my palm. It was happening. They were dismantling my life, piece by piece, right out from under me. A third buzz, an email. The subject line was blunt, 24-hour eviction notice. It was from my landlord. The lien from Shoreline was the reason. The room swam. The low hum of the servers seemed to magnify, filling my ears. Looks like you're out of options, kid, Mark said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. The whole room was watching now, a pack of hyenas waiting for the kill. I bet you $50 you won't call him. The bet hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't about the money. It was about the humiliation, about them watching me break. My hand trembled as I reached for the Post-it note. My fingers felt like clumsy, foreign things. I looked at the number, then at the eviction notice glowing on my screen. I saw my meager belongings being piled on a wet sidewalk. I saw the smug, predatory faces of the men from Shoreline. And then I saw the other thing. The thing that made this more than just a collections shakedown. The thing I hadn't told anyone. It was on the encrypted USB drive tucked into the hidden pocket of my jacket. The reason they really wanted those logs. A pattern I'd stumbled upon by accident. Calls about minor incidents, a fender bender, a dumpster fire that were being used to reroute ambulances, pulling them away from specific addresses in the West End just moments before a real, Critical call came from that exact, now uncovered zone. It was subtle, brilliant, and deadly, and I had the proof. They didn't just want to silence me. They wanted to erase a trail, and I was sitting right on top of it. My choice was gone. There was no running, no hiding. There was only the precipice and the long drop down, or the number. My fingers moved on their own, tapping the digits into my phone. The room went silent. The only sound was the clicking of my screen and the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. I pressed the call button. It didn't even finish the first ring. The line clicked open with an unnerving finality. There was no greeting, just an expectant, bottomless silence on the other end. It was so quiet I could hear the faint, distant sound of rain, a sound that wasn't coming from my own window. My voice came out in a ragged, breathless rush, a dispatcher's report stripped of all its calm. My name is Alara North. I'm a 911 intern. A group called Shoreline Servicers is trying to force me to turn over call logs. They've frozen my bank account. I'm being evicted. They're trying to cover something up in the system, and I have the recordings. They're coming for me. I stopped, gasping for air, my entire story laid bare in less than 30 seconds. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever known. 1 second, 2, 3. Each tick of the clock on the wall was a hammer blow. I thought he'd hung up. I thought it was a deadline, a prank, the final, crushing punchline to the joke. Then, a voice. It was low, rough like worn leather, and utterly devoid of emotion. It spoke a single word. Come. The line went dead. Before I could even process it, my phone lit up with a text from an anonymous number. It was a location, the Albatross Diner, Pier 14, followed by a string of numbers, backdoor code 8410. I stared at the screen, my mind a blank slate. What had I just done? Had I just made a deal with the devil, or had I just called his boss? The line between right and wrong had dissolved into a gray, terrifying fog. My dilemma was cut short by a sound from my apartment's security feed, which I kept open on a small side monitor. The grainy black and white image showed 2 large men standing on my doorstep. One of them raised a heavy fist and began to pound on the door. My building's intercom buzzed, a harsh, angry shriek that cut through the dispatch center's hum. Alara North Shoreline Servicers. We have a work order to check the gas meter. The lie was so blatant, so aggressive. It was its own kind of threat. They weren't waiting anymore. My body moved before my brain could object. I logged out of my station, my hands flying across the keyboard. I stood up, my chair rolling back with a sharp squeal. Mark and the others stared, their smirks gone, replaced by a wide-eyed shock. I didn't look at them. I grabbed my jacket. My fingers fumbled for the zipper, finally finding purchase. I checked the hidden pocket, my driver's license, my phone, and the small, cool rectangle of the USB drive. It was all there. As I walked towards the emergency exit, my phone chimed with a second text from the same anonymous number. Bring everything they want you for. He knew, of course, he knew. The air outside was a slap of frigid, wet wind. The Washington rain wasn't gentle, it was an icy, relentless assault, coming down in hard, diagonal sheets that turned the streetlights into blurry halos. Ardmore Harbor was a city of water and shadows, and tonight, it felt like both were trying to swallow me whole. I pulled my hood up and ran, my sneakers splashing through deep puddles, the sound of the pounding on my apartment door still echoing in my ears. Pier 14 was at the edge of the industrial district, a place of forgotten warehouses and the lonely cries of foghorns. The Albatross Diner was a relic from another era, a long silver tube of a building with a single, sputtering neon sign that cast a sickly green glow onto the slick, wet asphalt. It was the only light for blocks. I circled around back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The alley smelled of salt, rust, and old grease. I found the keypad by the steel door, my shaking fingers punching in the code, 8410. A soft click, and the door swung inward into darkness. I slipped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust. The diner was nearly empty. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. 2 customers were scattered among the cracked vinyl booths, lone figures staring into their mugs, their faces hidden in shadow. Neither of them looked up as I walked past, my dripping jacket leaving a trail on the checkered linoleum floor. They were part of the scenery, as permanent and silent as the napkin dispensers. At the far end of the counter, a man was sitting on a stool, his back to me. All I could see was a long, dark overcoat and a head of thick, dark hair. He was perfectly still. As I hesitated, halfway down the length of the diner, he stood up. He didn't make a sound. He didn't turn quickly. He simply rose to his full height in one fluid, economical motion, but in that single movement, he seemed to draw all the light and air in the room towards him. The 2 other patrons, who I'd thought were oblivious, suddenly shifted, their shoulders tensing. The space around him crackled with a silent, invisible authority. He turned, and his eyes found mine across the room. They were dark, intelligent, and held a depth that seemed to see right through my fear, right through my skin, and into the frantic, desperate calculations of my soul. He wasn't what I had expected. There was no obvious menace, no brutish display of power, just a profound, unsettling stillness, an absolute certainty. And in that moment, I knew. I knew with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the freezing rain outside. This was him. This was Dorian Lazaro. He didn't gesture for me to sit. He didn't smile. His eyes, dark and analytical, held mine as if he were reading a case file I hadn't yet submitted. The diner, which had seemed empty and cavernous, now felt pressurized, the air thick and still. The 2 patrons in the booths hadn't moved, but their stillness was no longer passive. It was a coiled, waiting energy. "Alara Marie North," he said. His voice was exactly as I'd heard it on the phone, a low, gravelly timbre that didn't need volume to command the room. He didn't ask my name, he stated it, as if correcting an error I hadn't yet made. "Born September 14th, he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Current address 415 West Inlet Drive, apartment 3B, eviction notice served 51 minutes ago." He glanced at his watch, a simple, dark-faced timepiece. "Your supervisor at the Ardmore Dispatch Center is Michael Vance. He has a weakness for off-track betting, which is why he's susceptible to pressure. Your social security number ends in 4,420, and your frozen bank account holds a current balance of $87.14. My blood didn't just run cold, it evaporated. This was beyond what Shoreline knew. They had my financials, my address. This man had my identity. The fear I'd felt from the pounding on my apartment door was a dull ache compared to the sharp, surgical terror of this moment. He wasn't just a powerful man. He was a network, an intelligence agency unto himself. "You know," I breathed, the words catching in my throat, "I know you're in trouble you didn't ask for, but that you earned by being meticulous," he corrected. He finally gestured a slight, downward motion of his chin toward the booth opposite his. "Sit, the coffee is terrible, but it's hot." I slid into the booth, the vinyl cold and cracked against my damp clothes. I was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the profound realization that I was in a room where I was, by far, the weakest thing. I fumbled in the hidden pocket of my jacket. The USB drive felt small and insignificant in my trembling hand. I slid it across the Formica table. It stopped near his hand, which rested, palm down, on the surface. He didn't look at the drive. He kept his eyes on me. "You brought what they wanted," he stated. "I brought why they want it," I corrected, my voice barely a whisper. My dispatcher training, the one thing I could cling to, kicked in. The instinct to report facts clearly, without emotion. It's a pattern. In the 911 logs, I thought it was a glitch at first. Calls are being manipulated, rerouted. "Explain," he said. "It's the West End. They're using fake, low-priority calls, noise complaints, fender benders. Sometimes even a false wellness check to pull ambulances and patrol cars 5, sometimes 10 blocks out of position. It only lasts for minutes, maybe 90 seconds at a time, but it's precise. Precise to what end? To when the real calls come in, I said, my voice gaining a fraction of confidence as I spoke the truth I knew. Small electrical fires, always at temporary bank branches, the kind set up in trailers or modular offices during construction booms. By the time emergency services correct the route and get there, the fire is out, and the vaults are empty. It's the Harrogate crew. Everyone knows they're robbing them, but they're doing it in the blind spot, the one I'm supposed to be watching. Dorian Lazaro didn't react, but a new, sharper focus entered his gaze. He wasn't just listening, he was calculating. His eyes finally dropped to the USB drive, but he didn't pick it up. Harrogate, he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. They're messy. Brutes, this. He tapped the table. Isn't messy. This is surgical. They're just the muscle. He looked back up at me, and I felt like I was being x-rayed, and the fires are just the distraction. They're not just stealing cash, they're washing it. Washing it how? The city's Urban Restoration Fund, he said, the words laced with a profound, weary cynicism. It was set up after the '99 quake. It's a fire hose of federal money meant to rebuild. You can't just deposit $3 million in stolen cash, but you can donate it to a civic restoration fund and have it come out clean on the other side. Earmarked for construction contracts your own shell companies are waiting to bid on. He tapped a single finger on the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. This entire scheme runs under the shelter of an agency that doesn't officially exist, the Office of Urban Integrity. UI. I'd seen the acronym on interdepartmental memos. I'd assumed they were just another layer of city bureaucracy, another committee signing off on permits. Dorian's gaze hardened. They want those logs, Miss North, because you haven't just found a string of robberies. You found the plumbing for the entire operation. They don't just want to shut you up. They want to erase you. He leaned forward, the faint neon light catching the sharp line of his jaw. They want you silenced. I want you to keep talking. As if summoned by his words, the neon albatross sign outside the window sputtered with a sharp bzzzt. The lights inside the diner buzzed and flickered, plunging us into a half-second of darkness before humming back to a sickly, flickering green-yellow. In that brief moment of darkness, I saw the silhouette of a heavy-duty pickup truck, the kind shoreline servicers used, as it rolled to a stop right outside, its high beams, full of illegal grade LEDs, cut through the rain, perfectly blocking the front door and window. It was a blockade, pinning us in the light. Dorian didn't startle. He didn't even look over his shoulder. He just tilted his head, a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible, as if listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. The bell above the diner's front door jangled violently. My heart leaped into my throat, a suffocating, painful muscle spasm. 2 men stomped in, shaking the rain from their heavy canvas jackets. They were the same men from my apartment's security feed, the one who had pounded on my door, a mountain of a man with a face like angry, wet concrete, and his partner, a thinner, twitchy man with eyes that darted everywhere before landing, with a flash of triumph, on me. A wave of pure, primal panic seized me. I started to slide out of the booth, my only thought to run for the back door I'd come through. Dorian's hand shot across the table not to grab me, but just resting flat, palm down, a silent, unmovable command. Stay. The 2 men ambled toward the counter, putting on a poor show of being casual customers. Just need 2 coffees, black. The big one grunted at the counter, though there was no one there to serve him. The cook, I realized, had vanished into the back the moment I sat down. They were trying to look like customers, but their jackets were too bulky, pulled tight over their shoulders in a way that screamed, "Holster!" under the left sleeve of the twitchy one, as he adjusted his collar. I saw it a hard, metallic line that was definitely not a wallet. They weren't here for coffee. They were here to drag me out. The big one looked past the counter, right at me. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is. Little Miss Protocol. You're a hard person to find, Ilara. Your landlord's real upset about the damages." Damages I hadn't even been home. They were already building their cover story. Dorian still hadn't turned around. He kept his back to them. He just lifted his left hand from the table and placed it on the Formica counter's edge. With his index finger, he tapped, tack, tack, tack. 3 quiet, precise sounds, barely audible above the rain and the hum of the ballast, a signal. The kitchen door, the one marked Employees Only, swung open. 2 men emerged. They looked nothing like the Shoreline thugs. They wore simple, dark work pants and plain Henley shirts, like they could have been short-order cooks or longshoremen just getting off a shift. One was slowly, meticulously drying his hands on a clean white apron he'd tied around his waist. The other was sipping from a steaming ceramic mug. They didn't rush, they didn't shout, they didn't draw weapons, they simply positioned themselves. The one with the apron moved to stand directly in front of the counter, polishing a glass, blocking the thug's path to me. The other man, the one with the coffee, walked past them, toward the front door. He stopped to lean against the old, silent jukebox, taking another sip as he gazed out at the rain, effectively and silently cutting off their only exit. It happened in absolute, terrifying silence. The twitchy thug's eyes widened. His hand started to move toward the lump under his jacket. The man by the jukebox just shook his head, a tiny, disapproving motion, and took another sip of his coffee. The big one, the leader, looked from the man at the jukebox to the man in the apron. He measured the distance. He measured their calm. He saw, as I did, that this wasn't a fight. It was a mathematical equation that had already been solved. They were trapped. They were outclassed. The 2 men in the diner hadn't just appeared. They had been waiting. We'll come back," the big one stammered, his bravado dissolving into the stale air. Wrong place. The man in the apron just nodded, not even looking up from the glass he was polishing. Good idea. The 2 thugs, trying to maintain a shred of dignity, turned and walked stiffly toward the door. The man at the jukebox didn't move an inch, forcing them to squeeze past him, one by one, brushing against his shoulder. As they burst back out into the freezing rain, the truck outside roared to life and sped away, its tires squealing on the wet asphalt. The kitchen door swung shut. The man at the jukebox went back to his booth. Sitting down as if nothing had happened, the man in the apron disappeared back into the kitchen. The entire event, from their entry to their exit, had taken less than 30 seconds. My jaw was hanging open. I was breathing in short, shallow gasps. I'd spent my entire internship hearing the soundtrack of violence, shouting, sirens, desperation, pain. I had never witnessed power like this. It was silent. It was absolute. It didn't need to raise its voice. The terror that had been sitting in my stomach for weeks didn't disappear, but it changed. It crystallized. It sharpened from a blunt, agonizing fear into a cold, hard point of focus. Dorian finally turned his head, watching the retreating taillights of the truck until they vanished. He looked back at me. "You see," he said, his voice still that same calm, terrifying level. "They're loud, they're clumsy, they rely on fear, but the people they work for, they're quiet. You have to be quieter." His eyes dropped to the USB. He pushed it back across the table, the plastic scraping lightly on the formica. It stopped just short of my fingers. "You keep it," he said. I stared at the drive. I thought this was for you. I thought this was my payment for helping. I don't need the drive. Miss North, I have what I need right here. He tapped his temple. The information is the currency. The drive is just a liability. It belongs to the person who had the courage to keep it. I wrapped my cold fingers around the small device. It felt warm from the diner, heavy, like a talisman. He leaned back, assessing me, the interrogation apparently over. "So, You have a choice. You didn't have one when you walked in here, terrified and cornered. Now you do." He laid out the options with the dispassion of a judge, of a man who had offered this choice before. Path 1. You run. I can have you on a plane to somewhere warm and quiet in an hour. New name, new bank account, new life. You'll be safe. But they'll still be here. And this, he nodded toward the USB in my hand, will have all been for nothing. And path 2, I asked. Though I already knew the answer, I knew which one he represented. Path 2, he said, a new, cold intensity entering his voice. You stand with me. You use that. He gestured to my brain. That dispatcher's mind that sees patterns no one else does. You help me aim, and we take them down. Not just Shoreline, not just Harrogate, all of it, the Office of Urban Integrity. We burn the rot out of this city's foundation. He didn't sugarcoat it. It's not safe, and it's not right in the way you're used to. But it will be final. I looked past him, through the rain-lashed window, at the dark, churning water of the harbor. I could hear the distant, mournful sound of a foghorn out on the water, a lonely call in the dark. I thought of the eviction notice, the frozen bank account, the smug look on Mark's face, the thud of that fist on my door. Running meant they won. Running meant I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, a victim. I had been a victim my whole life, passed from one foster home to another, always silent, always accommodating, always trying not to be noticed. My hand closed tightly around the USB drive, the sharp edges digging into my palm. I met his gaze. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. "I'm tired of running," I said, my voice as steady as his. "I don't want the path that's safe. I want the one that ends this." A flicker of something passed through Dorian Lazaro's eyes. It wasn't approval. It wasn't a smile. It was recognition, like a metallurgist seeing a raw piece of iron and recognizing its potential to become steel. "Good," he said, standing up and throwing a few bills on the counter. Far too much for a coffee he never drank. "The night's not over. We have work to do." My new home wasn't an apartment, it was a ghost of one. Perched high in the rafters of a massive alderstone warehouse on Pier 7, it was a loft space carved out of the industrial skeleton of the building. Exposed brick walls, still faintly smelling of a century of sea salt and diesel, rose to meet a ceiling of dark, heavy timber beams. A wall of reinforced glass looked out over the sprawling, floodlit labyrinth of the port, a vista of cranes standing like sleeping steel dinosaurs against the night sky. There was a bed, a small kitchen unit, a bathroom, and a powerful, dedicated internet line. There were no pictures on the walls, no mail in the slot, no name on the door. To Shoreline servicers and the rest of the world, Ilara North had vanished from the map. The safety was a strange, hollow thing. I'd sleep for a few hours at a time, waking with a jolt, expecting the thud of a fist on the door, only to hear the low groan of a container ship being nudged into its berth by a tugboat. My life had been condensed to this single, secure, and utterly anonymous room. Dorian didn't treat me like a refugee. He treated me like an asset. On the second day, he led me down a flight of echoing steel stairs to a section of the warehouse floor that had been walled off and soundproofed. Inside wasn't a boardroom or an office, but a nerve center humming with the quiet, intense energy of processing power. Banks of servers blinked in the cool, climate-controlled air. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all younger than me, sat before a mosaic of glowing monitors, their fingers flying across keyboards with silent, focused speed. They didn't look up when we entered. "This is Arclight," Dorian said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet space. "They handle my digital infrastructure. They find things that don't want to be found." The woman, her hair in a tight, practical bun, finally looked over. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Heard you brought us a puzzle. North." I nodded, feeling like a rookie again. A messy one. "They're all messy," she said, turning back to her screen. "Plug it in. Let's see what you've got." For the next 48 hours, that room became my world. The ArcLight team took the raw data from my USB drive and projected it onto a massive central screen. It was like seeing my dispatcher's console magnified 1,000 times. They began peeling back the layers of the malware infecting the 911 routing system, revealing the elegant, insidious code that allowed for the diversions. It was a digital ghost, leaving almost no trace, designed to mimic a system glitch, almost. "It's the command string," I found myself saying on the third day, pointing at a line of code that flickered erratically. I'd been staring at it for hours, the patterns of the system so deeply ingrained in my mind that I could feel when something was wrong, even if I didn't know the language it was written in. A real system reset command has a static identifier. This one, it changes. It's trying to hide, but the shadow it casts is always the same shape. The woman, her name was Lena, zoomed in on the string. Her eyes narrowed. "It's a digital watermark. Well hidden. Give me a minute." Her fingers became a blur. Code cascaded down the screen. She was following the shadow I'd pointed out, chasing it back through a maze of rerouted servers and spoofed IP addresses. It was like watching someone run a thread back through an impossibly tangled knot. After 20 minutes of intense, silent work, a single location resolved on a map of Ardmore Harbor. "Got it," Lena said, leaning back. "The commands originate from a single, hard-lined server, secure off-network. It's located at the North Point Civic Center." I stared at the name. The North Point Civic Center was a half-finished shell of a building downtown, a public works project that had been stalled for years until a recent, massive influx of funding. I saw from a quick search on a secondary monitor that was being administered by the Office of Urban Integrity, OUI. It wasn't just a slush fund, it was a physical headquarters for their operations, disguised as urban renewal, a data collection hub hiding in plain sight. But that was the how. I still needed the why. I pushed aside the code. "Lena, can you pull up the Port Authority's shipping manifests for the last 3 months? Cross-reference them with the timestamps on the ambulance diversions." It was a dispatcher's hunch, a gut feeling born from thousands of hours of listening to the city's chaotic symphony. You learn that nothing is truly random. Every incident has a ripple. I was looking for the stones that were being tossed into the pond. The data flooded another screen. On the left, the list of rerouted ambulance calls short, 2-minute diversions, scattered across the West End. On the right, a dense log of every shipping container that had been moved at the port. They looked completely unrelated, chaos and commerce. But they weren't. "There," I whispered, my finger tracing a line on the screen. "Look, Tuesday, 2:04 a.m., a false alarm, dumpster fire on 3rd and Westlake. Ambulance Unit 7 is diverted. It lasts exactly 120 seconds. I dragged my finger across to the other screen. Tuesday, 2:05 a.m., a container, manifest designation, humanitarian aid medical supplies, is loaded onto a truck at berth 43. It happens every time. A 2-minute window, a fake emergency call, and one of these containers gets moved. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying, sickening clarity. Later that evening, I explained it to Dorian as we stood on the catwalk outside the loft, the cold, salty wind whipping around us. "It's a smokescreen," I told him. My voice raised slightly over the wind. "The robberies at the banks, the fires, they're just noise. Loud, violent noise to make the cops look one way. The real crime is happening here, at the port, quietly. They create these fake hotspots, these emergency vacuums, to ensure a clean exit for those containers." Dorian stared out at the sprawling port, his hands resting on the iron railing. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "Those containers aren't filled with gauze and antibiotics. Elara," he said, his voice flat, "they're filled with illicit pharmaceuticals, fentanyl, mostly, coming in from overseas. Disguised as donated medical equipment to bypass customs inspections. The Harrogate crew aren't just thieves, they're the distribution network. OUI provides the clean route out of the port. Harrogate moves the product onto the street, and the money gets washed back through the restoration fund. It's a perfect self-sustaining circle. My stomach turned. This wasn't just about money, people were dying from this. The ghost in the machine I had found was a merchant of death. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating. "We can stop it," I said, the idea forming even as I spoke it. "We can use their own system against them. We can set a trap." He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the harsh glare of the security lights. "Go on." "We create our own ghost," I explained, the plan solidifying. "A time trap. Arclight can build a virtual fire alarm protocol, a much bigger one than they use for the diversions. We'll trigger it for a specific abandoned industrial block near their main route. For 90 seconds, every official unit in a 2-mile radius will be routed there, but we'll already have our own cameras in place, independent of the city's network. We can lock their route into our kill box and record the entire handoff from the container to the Harrogate truck." For the first time since I'd met him, I saw something shift in Dorian's eyes. Respect. "A dispatcher's solution," he said, a hint of something that might have been admiration in his voice. "Using their own weapon, I like it." He pulled out his phone. "Arclight will get it done." While the tech team worked on my idea, I dove back into the data, this time focusing on the OUI's public donor records. It was a long list of respectable corporations and philanthropic foundations, but one name, buried deep in the list, appeared over and over, with donations made through a dozen different smaller entities. The Harrogate Civic League? It was a thread, and I pulled it. The League was a registered nonprofit chaired by a man named Eamon Pike. A quick encrypted search through the darker corners of the web that Arclight gave me access to painted a clearer picture. Eamon Pike, an old money name with new money ruthlessness. He and Dorian had history. They'd come up in the same brutal world. Rivals who had carved the city's underworld into 2 distinct territories. But Pike was getting ambitious. He was using the OUI to legitimize his operations and wage a silent war on Lazzaro's territory. Just as I connected the final dot, a low, deep whump echoed across the water. The thick glass wall of the loft vibrated. Far out, near the end of Pier 12, a plume of black smoke billowed into the night sky from a small, contained explosion, an electrical generator. It looked like a warning shot. Dorian's phone buzzed on the table beside me. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and then showed it to me. A simple, anonymous text. A greeting from Pike. A wave of vertigo hit me. This wasn't about a student loan. This wasn't about Shoreline's thugs. This was a war between kings, fought with malware and back-alley deals, for the right to control the city's arteries, its emergency services, its shipping lanes, its very infrastructure. And I had just stumbled onto the battlefield, holding the enemy's map. "He knows we're looking," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate. Dorian's expression was calm, his face carved from granite. "He knows someone is... He doesn't know who. Not yet." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "You didn't cause this, Alara. You just saw it first, but you can end it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin, hard plastic card. He placed it in my hand. It was an Alderstone Holdings security pass, high-level clearance. My photo, taken from a security camera feed somewhere, was printed on it, and beneath my name, Alara North, was my designation. Partner. The card felt impossibly heavy. It was a shield, an entry into a world of power I'd never known, but it was also a target. It was a declaration of allegiance. It was the weight of a life placed in my hands, a life I had chosen in a desperate, late-night phone call for the first time. I felt something that was both a profound honor and a terrifying burden. Trust. The immediate shock of Pike's greeting, the dull whump of the explosion on Pier 12 had faded, leaving behind a humming, electric tension. The smoke was a dark smudge against the bruised purple of the night sky. I'd gone out onto the flat, industrial roof of the warehouse, needing to feel the air, to verify the reality of the threat. The loft, for all its security, suddenly felt like a cage. The wind coming off the harbor was a living thing. It was cold, sharp, and relentless, smelling of deep water, salt, and diesel. It tore through my thin sweater, a physical reminder of how exposed I truly was. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering, but I didn't go back inside. I heard a single, heavy footstep on the gravel roof behind me and knew it was him. Dorian didn't move silently. He just moved with purpose, displacing the air around him. He stopped, not beside me, but a few feet away, also watching the last vestiges of smoke. He'd been on his encrypted radio for 20 minutes, his voice a low, calm series of commands that resulted in the distant wail of his sirens. Not the city's. Alderstone Fire and Rescue, a private service I hadn't known existed, was already dousing the flames. He saw me shiver. I tried to hide it, to straighten my spine, but the cold was too deep. I saw him shrug, a fluid motion in the dark. He stepped forward, and before I could react, he was draping his overcoat over my shoulders. It wasn't the jacket he'd worn in the diner. This was a heavy, impeccably tailored wool coat. The weight of it was staggering. A sudden, profound armor against the wind. It was impossibly warm, and it enveloped me in a scent that was uniquely his. Not a cologne, but something clean, masculine, and grounded, like cedarwood and old leather, a scent of absolute, unshakable stability. "Thank you," I murmured, clutching the lapels. He just nodded, turning his attention back to the port. For a few minutes, we stood in a silence that wasn't empty, but shared. Below us, the port was a sprawling galaxy of lights, yellow sodium lamps, white floodlights on the cranes, the steady green and red running lights of ships moving in the channel. "See that boat?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He pointed, not with his whole hand, but with a slight jut of his chin. A sleek, dark patrol boat with a single green light was cutting a fast, clean wake near the mouth of the harbor. "That's not APD. That's ours. Alderstone funds the civilian harbor watch." "Why? The police are too slow, too compromised." He said the word as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You can't protect a city if you only respond to its emergencies. You have to anticipate them. You have to own the water, own the sight lines." He had built a parallel system, a private 911, a private fire department, a private police force. He hadn't just built a company. He'd fortified an entire city. The distant sound of a real siren, a city ambulance this time, drifted up from the streets of Ardmore. The high, desperate wail was a sound so familiar it was woven into my DNA. "I used to time them," I said, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd spoken aloud. Dorian turned his head, his profile sharp against the city lights. "The sirens," I clarified, pulling his heavy coat tighter. The confession tumbled out, a thing I hadn't told anyone. When I was in foster care, some of the homes were bad, loud, chaotic. I'd lie awake and listen for the sirens. They were the only sound in the world that meant order. That meant someone was coming, that the chaos had a response. I looked at my hands, hidden in the coat's deep pockets. It's a weird thing to admit, but they were my lullaby. It's why I became a dispatcher. I wanted to be that person, the calm voice on the other end of the panic. I risked a glance at him. He wasn't looking at me with pity. That would have been unbearable. He was just watching me, listening. His stillness was a form of respect, an invitation to continue. That's why what Pike is doing, it feels like a violation, he finished for me, his voice rough. I nodded, the admission stinging my eyes. My supervisor, Michael Vance, the one you named, weeks ago. He pressured me to clean up a log, just a minor adjustment to a timestamp on a call I'd handled. He said it was a clerical error, that it would get him in trouble if I didn't. I knew it was wrong, but I was terrified of losing the internship. It was my one shot. I swallowed. the shame burning my throat. So I did it. I altered the log, and now I know. I was probably covering for one of them, for OUI, before I even knew they existed. Dorian said nothing, but I saw his hands, resting on the iron parapet, clench into fists. His knuckles went white, the only sign of the cold, controlled rage building inside him. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry at Vance, at the system. "He used your fear against you," Dorian said, his voice dangerously quiet, a razor's edge. "He forced you to compromise the very thing you value." The vulnerability of the moment hung in the air, fragile and heavy. It was shattered by a sharp, electronic squawk, a small, encrypted radio on Dorian's belt. A clipped, professional voice, not Lena's, but someone in the field cut through the wind. "Alpha 1 to base. We have a shadow. Dark sedan. No plates. Been on our tail since the 405 junction. Employee transport. Route 6. Dorian didn't even blink. The strategist, the general, was back. He pressed the transmit button on his radio. "Merge streams," he commanded. "Route 6. Authorized diversion to Channel 4. I want that sedan isolated." That was it. 2 words. Not a question or a discussion. A command that, I knew, was already setting a complex sequence of moves into play on the streets below. My dispatcher's mind marveled at the efficiency. A few blocks away, his employee transport van would be seamlessly absorbed into a convoy of identical Alderstone vehicles, while the shadow would be peeled off, flanked, and, I had no doubt, dealt with. A small, shaky laugh escaped me. It was half relief, half terror. "Merge streams," I repeated, shaking my head. "You really don't use more words than you have to, do you?" He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "When I called you," I explained, "from the dispatch center, when I was falling apart, you just said come. 1 word. It's all you said." He turned back to the city, the immediate crisis handled. It was the only word that was needed. "Elara." He said my name. It landed differently this time, not as the subject of an intelligence file, but as me. The wind gusted, harder this time, an icy, violent shove. It pushed me back a step, and the back of my legs hit the cold, solid metal parapet of the roof. I was cornered by the elements. Dorian turned his body fully toward me, blocking the wind. He was suddenly, overwhelmingly close. I was trapped between the cold iron behind me and the solid, radiating warmth of his body in front of me. The space between us was electric, charged with all the things we weren't saying. I could smell the cedar and the cold rain on his skin. My breath hitched. The intensity, the proximity, it was too much. I dropped my gaze, staring at the dark wool of the coat clutched in my fists. His hand came up. It was gloved in black leather. I flinched, expecting, I don't know what, but he didn't touch my face. He didn't grab me. He placed a single, firm finger under my chin and gently, irresistibly, tilted my head up until my eyes were forced to meet his. His gaze was fierce, analytical, and held a fire I hadn't seen before. "Don't," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. "Don't bow your head, not to me, not to Pike, not to any of them, ever again." It wasn't a sweet reassurance. It was a forging, an order. He was reinforcing my spine, demanding I become the partner his ID card claimed I was. A jagged knife of lightning split the sky, illuminating his face in a stark, monochrome flash. It was followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundation. And then, the sky opened. The rain wasn't a drizzle, it was a deluge, a solid wall of freezing water. "Inside," he ordered, his hand dropping from my chin to my back, not lingering, just a firm pressure urging me to move. We ran, slipping on the wet gravel, and burst back into the warm, dry loft. The door slammed shut, sealing us in, the roar of the storm a sudden, muted background noise. We were both breathing hard. I was dripping, and he was soaked. The heavy coat was a casualty, plastered with rain. I shrugged it off my shoulders, intending to hand it back, but he ignored it. He stalked past me to the small bathroom and emerged a second later with a clean, white towel. He tossed it to me. "Dry off." I did, my hands shaking slightly. I scrubbed the towel over my hair, wringing out the water, my hair plastered to my face and neck. The single lamp by the bed cast a warm, yellow glow, and I could see my own reflection in the dark, massive window, the storm raging behind it. I stopped, the towel in my hands, and looked up. He was just watching me. He hadn't moved. He stood by the door, water dripping from his dark hair onto the hardwood floor, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. The silence was back, but it was no longer calm. It was charged, heavy, and thick as velvet. He took one slow step toward me. My breath caught in my throat. He took another. He was close enough now that I could feel the heat coming off him, see the individual droplets of rain clinging to his eyelashes. His hand lifted, and I knew. He was going to brush the wet strands of hair from my cheek. I held my breath. My heart was a frantic drum, a wild, panicked bird in my chest. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between us for a long, agonizing second. I saw the muscles in his jaw clench with a visible, profound effort of will. His hand closed into a tight fist. He dropped it to his side. He turned away from me, breaking the connection, and walked to the window. He stared out at the lashing rain, his back to me. A wall of control, slammed back into place. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. I leaned against the table for support, my legs weak, and in that moment, I could finally, definitively name the feeling that was flooding my system. It was raw, it was powerful, and it was absolutely terrifying. And for the first time in my life, I knew, without question, it wasn't fear. The tension was broken by a soft, electronic chime. It wasn't the radio. It was the dedicated terminal Arclight had set up in the corner. I crossed the room, my legs unsteady. Dorian turned from the window as I read the screen. It was a message from Lena. "We're in. We isolated the primary command kernel. Pike is sloppy. He used a known exploit from a 2022 patch. We can't take control, but we can inject a payload. Your time trap is viable. Tomorrow night, 0300. That's the window. They're moving another humanitarian shipment then." The brief, charged piece was over. The war was on. Dorian was at my shoulder, reading the message over me. His presence was all business now, the strategist back in command. "Tomorrow," he said. He looked at me, his eyes clear and cold. "Arclight will prep the payload. You will be the dispatcher. You'll be in the server, watching the routes. You give the signal. You spring the trap." "And you?" I asked, my voice small. "I'll be the target," he said simply. "Pike's getting aggressive. He wants me. When your trap springs, Harrowgate's convoy will be exposed. Pike will have to react personally to protect his operation. I'll be there to draw his fire." He paused. "I will be the tip of the spear." "You'll be standing on the X," I whispered. "The dispatcher term for the point of greatest danger." "It's the only way to ensure he commits," Dorian said, his voice void of any fear. "To get him and his OUI partners in the same net at the same time." The weight of it all, my past, his present, the impossible battle we were facing settled on me. I looked at him, the man who had answered a desperate call from a terrified intern and shown her a world of silent, lethal power. "Dorian," I said, my voice trembling for a different reason now. If I'm in the middle of it and if I call, will you answer me with one word again?" He turned, his dark eyes holding a promise that was more binding than any law. He stepped close, but didn't touch me. The heat from his body was a physical presence. Always. We both understood. This game we were in, this world of shadows and data, didn't spare dreamers. It broke them. But standing there, with the storm lashing the windows and the promise of a battle at dawn. We let ourselves dream anyway. The 24 hours leading up to the operation were the longest of my life. The loft became a cage again, a place of forced, restless calm before the storm. I didn't sleep. I drank coffee, studied the schematics of Yard 43 that Arclight provided, and ran through the plan in my head 1,000 times. I was no longer an intern taking calls. I was a dispatcher about to send men into the dark, and the weight of it was a physical pressure on my chest. When the time came, I wasn't in the loft. I was back in the humming, chilled nerve center with Lena and her team. My station was at the center of the room, a throne of monitors displaying a god's eye view of the city. One screen showed the city's 911 grid, a living map of its emergencies. Another displayed the feeds from our own, hidden cameras, their infrared lenses cutting through the inky blackness of the container yard. A third was a secure communications link, a direct line to Dorian's team. My headset was light, but it felt like a helmet. My hands, resting on the keyboard, were steady. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it had been packed down, compressed into a hard diamond of focus. The clock on the main screen ticked over to 02:59. "All assets in position," a calm voice reported in my ear. It was Dorian. His call sign was simply base. "Acknowledged, base," I replied, my voice a flat, professional tone I barely recognized as my own. "Arclight, stand by to execute." Lena gave me a sharp nod from her station. The 90-second countdown clock I'd requested appeared in the corner of my screen. "Execute," I said. Lena's fingers flew. On the 911 grid, a new icon flared to life, a multi-alarm structure fire in a derelict block of brick warehouses a mile north of the port. The lie was live. I watched, mesmerized, as the system reacted. Red icons representing fire engines, blue for police cruisers, and white for ambulances began to move, their routes bending away from the port, their paths converging on my ghost. The board lit up like a Christmas tree, a beautiful, terrifying deception. "Diversion is active," I reported into the comm. "Your window is open, 90 seconds on my mark." As if on cue, 2 large, unmarked box trucks rumbled into the darkness of Yard 43 on my infrared feed. Harrowgate's crew. They moved with a clumsy, arrogant speed, pulling up alongside a specific container marked with the humanitarian aid stencil. The doors of the trucks opened. They were sloppy, confident they were invisible. Our cameras, hidden in the gantries of the cranes above, recorded every detail in crystal clear, high-definition black and white. "Target is in the box," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "They're making the exchange." Dorian's voice came back, a low rumble. "We see them, holding position." His team was parked a block away in a battered Ford F-250 with a faded Ardmore Rail Maintenance logo on the side. They were just another piece of the port's nocturnal machinery. Then something changed. A new vehicle entered the frame. Not a truck, but a sleek, black sedan that moved with a predator's grace. It parked at the edge of the yard, its headlights cutting sharp, white lines through the darkness. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He wasn't one of Harrowgate's thugs. He wore a tailored suit, no overcoat despite the cold, and he moved with an unhurried, proprietary air. He didn't hide in the shadows. He stepped into the light. "Base, we have a new player," I said, my focus narrowing. "Unidentified male, arriving in a black sedan." "I see him," Dorian replied, his voice suddenly tight. "It's Pike." My blood ran cold. Eamon Pike, here, in the open. It wasn't just an operation anymore. It was a confrontation. "Why is he here?" I whispered, more to myself than to Dorian. "He's baiting me," Dorian's voice crackled. "He wants this to be loud." As if to prove his point, Lena suddenly swore. "Ilara, I've got a massive data spike. Outbound stream from a building 2 blocks over. It's OUI. They're live streaming a charity telethon on a public access channel. The camera angle is... shit. It's pointed right at the entrance to the yard. They're setting up a kill zone for the media. If we make a move, they'll paint it as unprovoked gang violence." At the same instant, another Arclight tech called out, "I'm losing the city radio chatter. It's being flooded with white noise. Someone's hijacking the broadcast frequencies." Pike's trap wasn't just the live stream. It was a communications blackout. He was trying to isolate us, to record our actions while ensuring we couldn't call for any legitimate backup. There was no time to ask for permission. I was the dispatcher. I had to make the call. "Base, comms are compromised," I said, my voice sharp and clear. "Switching to Alderstone mesh. Now." I hit a single key. The public frequencies on my monitor went dead, and a new, encrypted channel pulsed to life. We were in our own private digital world. Pike must have known he'd lost us, because the response was immediate and brutal. On my screen, a heavy-duty pickup truck that had been part of Harrowgate's convoy suddenly roared to life. It peeled away from the group, its tires screaming, and accelerated directly toward a section of chain-link fence where one of Lena's techs, a young man named Ben, was crouched, monitoring a portable sensor array. "Base asset in danger," I yelled, professionalism shattering into raw panic. "West fence, they're going to run him down." I didn't even see Dorian move. One moment, he was a static heat signature near the rail maintenance truck. The next, he was a blur of motion, a streak of darkness moving with impossible speed. He wasn't running to save Ben. He was running at the truck. He hit the speeding vehicle like a linebacker. A full body, shoulder-first impact into the front quarter panel. The sound of the impact, a sickening crunch of metal and bone, was picked up by our microphones. At the exact moment of impact, he triggered a device on his belt, and a blinding, disorienting strobe light pulsed directly into the driver's eyes. The truck swerved violently. The driver, blinded and stunned, lost control. The pickup smashed through the fence, missing a terrified, scrambling Ben by inches, before plowing into a stack of empty pallets. The yard erupted into chaos. Pike's men, seeing the attack, started pulling weapons. "Lena, kill the yard lights," I commanded, my voice cold again, the panic replaced by a surgeon's focus. "Cut the power to the entire grid, now!" The world on my monitor plunged into absolute blackness. A second later, the infrared feed compensated. The Harrowgate crew were blind, fumbling in the dark, their figures illuminated only by the frantic beams of their own flashlights. But Dorian's men, equipped with night vision gear, were now ghosts. I watched as they moved through the chaos, fluid shadows disarming Pike's thugs with a brutal, silent efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Pike, realizing he'd lost control, backed toward his car. He jabbed a button on a remote. From the trunk of his sedan, 4 small objects lifted into the air. Drones. Their red indicator lights glowed like angry eyes in the darkness. "Airborne surveillance," Lena shouted. "They'll have our positions in seconds." I looked at my screens, at the drones, at the map of the port's own sprawling, OUI-funded security camera network. An idea, insane and desperate, flashed in my mind. "The port cameras," I said, pointing. "They're wireless transmitters. Can you overload them? Force a directed energy pulse through their broadcast antennas?" Lena stared at me for a second, then a wolfish grin spread across her face. "A localized EMP burst. Dirty, I love it." She slid a small, handheld controller across the desk to me. "This will focus the pulse. Aim with the joystick. The red button is the trigger." On my screen, I placed a targeting box over the cluster of red lights. My thumb found the button. I pressed it. For a half-second, the world on every monitor went white with static. Then, the picture returned. Pike's drones were falling. They tumbled from the sky like shot birds, their systems fried, crashing uselessly to the concrete. The fight was over. The surviving Harrowgate members were fleeing on foot into the darkness. Pike was in his car, burning rubber as he sped away. Dorian's voice came over the mesh, steady and controlled. "No pursuit. We have what we need. Exfiltrate now. Leave the package." On the infrared feed, I saw one of his men place a silver, hardened Pelican case on the ground, right where Pike's sedan had been parked. It was a copy of my USB drive, amplified with all the financial data ArcLight had uncovered, a calling card, a declaration of war left for OUI to find. Then, they were gone. The Alderstone vehicles melted back into the industrial nightscape of the port. The yard was left silent, littered with disabled thugs and smoking, grounded drones. The adrenaline, the pure, high-octane fuel that had been coursing through my veins, vanished, and the shaking started. It began in my fingertips, a violent tremor that quickly consumed my entire body. I gripped the edge of the console, but it didn't help. The headset suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I fumbled with it, my clumsy fingers finally managing to pull it off and let it clatter onto the desk. The door to the command center slid open. It was Dorian. A dark bruise was already forming on his cheekbone, and his coat was torn at the shoulder where he'd hit the truck. But he moved with that same impossible, deliberate calm. He walked across the silent room and stopped at my station. The entire ArcLight team was frozen, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, not in the soft way people imagine. It was an anchor. His hand was heavy, solid, and absolutely steady. The pressure was firm, a silent, powerful current that seemed to flow into me, pushing back against the violent, chaotic shaking. It was a message, clearer than any word he could have spoken. It is done. You are steady. I am here. Slowly, under the immense grounding weight of his hand, the tremor subsided. The violent shivering eased, then stopped. I was left hollowed out, ringing with an exhaustion so profound it felt like I'd been awake for 100 years. The last thing I remember was the quiet hum of the servers, the faint smell of ozone from the EMP burst, and the solid, unmoving weight of his hand on my shoulder. That night, we did not sleep. We walked back to the loft from the ArcLight command center in near total silence. The torrential rain had softened into a fine, persistent drizzle that misted the air and slicked the concrete under our feet. The violent energy of the night had passed, leaving the port in a state of weary, dripping quiet. The only sounds were the soft slap of our shoes on the wet ground, the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn, and the frantic, chaotic thrumming of my own heart finally beginning to slow. The adrenaline had left a hollow, ringing exhaustion in its wake. Every muscle in my body ached with a tension I hadn't realized I was holding. Dorian walked beside me, his torn coat a dark shadow in the pre-dawn gloom. He was a wall of contained energy, the bruises on his face standing out starkly in the pale glow of the security lights. But he moved without a hint of a limp, without any sign of the brutal impact he had absorbed. When we reached the steel door to the loft stairwell, he unlocked it and held it open for me. I walked past him, my arm brushing his, and the jolt of that simple contact was as powerful as the thunderclap hours earlier. I climbed the echoing stairs on legs that felt like they were made of lead, my mind a blank slate, scrubbed clean by the night's events. Inside, the loft was an island of warm, yellow light in the vast gray sea of the approaching dawn. The rain whispered softly on the tin roof, a gentle, rhythmic shushing that was a world away from the earlier storm. My jacket, still damp from the run across the roof, felt heavy and cold. I shrugged it off, letting it fall to the floor. My hair was a tangled mess, cold strands sticking to my neck and cheeks. I felt raw, stripped down to my essential self. Dorian hadn't followed me all the way in. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the gray light of the stairwell, his hand resting on the doorframe. He seemed to be holding himself there, as if crossing the threshold would be a violation of some unspoken rule, a breach of a contract I hadn't realized we'd signed. The protector does not enter the sanctuary. His eyes, dark and unreadable, watched me. I saw the conflict in them, the rigid control warring with an emotion he kept locked down so tightly it was almost invisible. He wasn't looking at me like an asset anymore. He was looking at me like a man looks at something fragile and precious that he's terrified of breaking. "You're safe now," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. The words were meant to be a comfort, a conclusion, but they sounded like a goodbye, like he was about to turn and walk away, leaving me in the safety he had built. And I knew, with a certainty that came from the deepest, most honest part of my soul, that I couldn't let him. Safety wasn't this room. It wasn't the locked door or the anonymous location. Safety was the anchor I'd felt in his hand on my shoulder. I took a step toward him, then another. I stopped just before him, in the warm pool of light from the single bedside lamp. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and wrapped my fingers around his wrist, around the cuff of his shirt. His skin was warm. He was solid, real. He didn't pull away. He didn't move. He just watched me, his breath held. I tugged gently. "Come inside, Dorian." He let me pull him over the threshold, into the light. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click, sealing us in. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. We stood there, my hand still on his wrist, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. The clock on the wall, a simple, round face, ticked softly, marking a passage of time that had ceased to have any meaning. My gaze met his, and this time, I didn't look away. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the faint lines of strain around them. I saw the fierce intelligence, the cold control, and beneath it all, I saw a flicker of something else, something raw and vulnerable that he had never meant for me to see. The world narrowed to the space between us. The rain, the port, Pike, UI, it all faded away, leaving only the charged, humming silence and the question hanging unspoken in his eyes. Slowly, as if moving through water, I lifted my other hand and placed it on his chest. I could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart under my palm. I rose on my toes, and he didn't move, didn't breathe. When our lips met, it wasn't the desperate crashing wave I might have expected after a night like this. It was the tide coming in, slow, inevitable, and absolute. It was a confirmation, not a conquest, a question I had been too afraid to ask, and an answer he had been waiting to give. The first touch was soft, hesitant, a bare whisper of contact, a moment of shared stillness. He didn't deepen the kiss. He pulled back, just enough for our eyes to meet again. His gaze searched mine, asking. I gave him my answer, a small, almost imperceptible nod. This time, when he kissed me, it was with a deliberate, heart-stopping tenderness that unmade me. It was a conversation without words, a series of questions and answers spoken through the slightest pressure, the softest touch. He brought his hand up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the simple, gentle gesture sent a tremor through my entire body. He broke the kiss again, resting his forehead against mine. Our breath mingled, warm in the cool air. "Okay," he whispered, his voice a rough, broken sound. Was all I could manage, a sound of pure assent. "More," he asked, the word a prayer. "More," I breathed. His hands were a revelation. They moved with that same deliberate, profound certainty he did everything with. But there was no dominance in his touch. He was exploring, learning the lines of my body as if committing them to memory. One hand slid from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my damp hair. The other settled on the small of my back, a firm, grounding pressure that held me steady. His touch was safe. It was respectful. He wasn't taking, he was offering. He was leaving the space for me to lead, to set the pace, to make the choices. And I did. I wrapped my arms around his neck, my fingers tracing the strong column of his throat, and pulled him closer, erasing the last fraction of an inch between us. The kiss deepened, and a soft, yielding sigh escaped my lips. It was a sound of surrender, not to him, but to this, to the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful feeling that was flooding every empty, lonely space inside me. Our clothes became a hindrance, a barrier to the warmth we were both seeking. They fell away, piece by piece, discarded in a soft, scattered line on the floor, but the focus never shifted from our faces, from the story being told in our eyes. I saw a flicker of a shy, uncertain smile touch his lips, a crack in the granite facade, and it was so unexpected, so deeply human, that I smiled back, a wide, genuine smile that bloomed into a soft laugh. His touch was exquisite, the rough texture of his fingertips tracing the delicate line of my collarbone, the warmth of his palm spreading across my shoulder blade, the slow, deliberate journey of his hand down the curve of my spine. It was a worship, a mapping of a new territory. There were no crude movements, no fumbled urgency. There was only the slow, deliberate filling of a long-held emptiness with a new and overwhelming warmth. It was a quiet, desperate homecoming to a place I had never known existed. Later, we lay tangled in the sheets, the gray light of dawn beginning to filter through the massive window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a profound, peaceful silence. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around me, his hand resting on my hip. I lay with my head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, a sound more reassuring than any lullaby I had ever known. Our fingers were intertwined, a simple, perfect knot. For the first time in my life, my entire body, my entire soul, felt still. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been my lifelong companion was gone. He stirred, his fingers tightening around mine. I thought he might be asleep, but then he spoke, his voice a low, quiet promise spoken into the darkness of my hair. "When you call," he said, "I will answer." I tilted my head back, looking up at his shadowed face. A small, true smile touched my lips. "One word is enough," I whispered. He leaned down and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of peace and promises. And in the quiet safety of his arms, with the city just beginning to wake outside our window, we finally drifted into a deep, dreamless, and desperately needed sleep. We didn't know it then, but it was just the eye of the storm, a rare, precious moment of calm before the real hurricane arrived. The peace was a fragile, beautiful lie, and it shattered with the morning news. I awoke to the soft gray light of dawn and the unfamiliar, profound feeling of being safe in someone's arms. For a few blissful, dreamlike moments, there was only the steady rhythm of Dorian's breathing and the warm, heavy weight of his arm around me. The storm had passed. Then, his phone, set to silent on the bedside table, began to vibrate, a low, insistent hum against the wood. He was awake in an instant, the transition from sleep to sharp-edged alertness seamless. He glanced at the screen, and I saw the calm vanish from his face, replaced by a cold, hard mask. He swung his legs out of bed, moving to the large screen on the wall and turning it on. The local 24-hour news channel filled the room, the volume low. The headline was a sucker punch. Alderstone Holdings accused of manipulating city emergency services in internal WUI probe. I sat bolt upright, the sheets pooling around my waist, a woman with a practiced, sincere face and a title card that read Maren Lutz, OUI Community Liaison, was standing at a podium, her expression a mask of grave concern. "Evidence uncovered by our internal investigation," she was saying, her voice smooth and reasonable, "points to a sophisticated scheme by elements within Alderstone Holdings to create ghost calls, diverting critical emergency services for their own private security operations, recklessly endangering the public. They weren't just denying our evidence. They were stealing our narrative. They had taken the truth of what they were doing and were wearing it like a costume, pointing the finger directly at us. Last night, Lutz continued. This scheme escalated, resulting in a violent confrontation at the port, instigated by Alderstone operatives. My phone, which I'd left on the coffee table, began to buzz and buzz and buzz again, a flood of notifications. I stumbled out of bed, pulling on one of Dorian's shirts that was lying on a chair, and picked it up. The first was a link to a news blog sent from my old supervisor, Michael Vance. The headline read, "Leaked Audio Implicates 911 Intern in Ghost Fire Conspiracy." My blood turned to ice. I tapped the link. My own voice filled the loft, tinny and distorted from the phone's speaker. "Initiating a virtual fire alarm protocol. Lock their route into our kill box." It was a collage of my words from the operation, expertly sliced and stitched together to make it sound like I was a rogue agent, a willing accomplice in Alderstone's fictitious plot. They had stripped out all the context, all the terror, all the desperation, and left only the cold, hard jargon of the attack. Texts from my former colleagues began to pour in. "Mark, I knew you were dirty." North, "Hope it was worth it, Sarah." "How could you?" People could have died. The final notification was an official email from the Ardmore Harbor 911 Dispatch Center. The subject line was cold and final, immediate and indefinite suspension. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, the phone slipping from my numb fingers. They had turned my own voice, my own skills, into the weapon that was crucifying me. My colleagues, the city I had tried to protect, they all thought I was the villain. Dorian's encrypted radio squawked to life. It was Lena. Her voice was strained, breathless. "Base, we have a problem, a big one. The cops are here. They have a warrant to seize our servers, the whole ArcLight facility." Dorian was already pulling on his pants, his movements economical and precise. He picked up the radio. "On what grounds?" "Warrant cites evidence tampering in an ongoing federal investigation," Lena replied, her voice tight with fury. "It's signed by a federal judge. It's real. We're wiping what we can. But they're coming in hard. Dorian, the warrant was issued less than an hour ago. No one moves that fast." Dorian's eyes met mine across the room. I saw the cold, hard calculation in his gaze. "They were waiting for us," he said, more to himself than to me. He spoke into the radio. "Evacuate. Comply with the warrant. Do not engage. Wipe the primary drives and abandon the hardware. Go." He clicked off the radio. "It was an inside job," he said, his voice flat. "They knew where to look. They knew when to look. There's a leak inside ArcLight." And in that moment, I knew. The doctored audio, the perfectly timed warrant to create that audio file. They would have needed access to our encrypted mesh network during the operation. They would have needed the raw feed, an access key. An API key. An API key I had given to one person. "Quinn," I whispered, the name tasting like poison. "Quinn Belov." He was the youngest member of the ArcLight team, a brilliant, eager coder who had helped me interface my dispatcher's knowledge with their systems. He was shy, quick to smile, and I had trusted him. When he told me he needed a direct access key to build a diagnostic tool for our comms, I hadn't hesitated. I had sent it to him myself. The sick, hollow feeling of betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. That evening, I found myself in a place where God had long since checked out. It was a deconsecrated church in the industrial flats, a brick shell with boarded-up stained glass windows. The air was cold and smelled of damp plaster and decay. We sat around a massive, rough-hewn wooden table that had been brought in and placed where the altar used to be. This was the Lazaro Collective's council, Dorian's lieutenants, the silent men from the diner, Lena from ArcLight, a half-dozen others with hard, quiet faces. They were the pillars of his invisible empire. In the center of the table was a single, grainy photograph, a surveillance still. It showed Quinn Belov in a parking garage, his face pale and terrified, accepting a thick manila envelope from a man whose face was in shadow, but whose bulky jacket and aggressive stance screamed Harrogate. I stared at the photo, at the face of the young man who had laughed at a stupid joke I'd made just 2 days earlier while we debugged a mapping interface. The boy in the picture didn't look like a master spy. He looked like a cornered animal, "Bring him in," Dorian commanded. Two of his men opened a side door, and Quinn was escorted into the room. He wasn't restrained, but the way he walked, with his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the floor, he was a prisoner all the same. He looked up, saw the photo on the table, and a small, broken sound escaped his lips. His eyes darted to me, and he flinched, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. Dorian didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of the silence in the room was accusation enough. He gestured to the photo. "Explain this. Quinn." Quinn just shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. Dorian wasn't a man for theatrical punishments. He was a strategist. He looked at the trembling young man. "They're going to burn you. You know that. Once you're no longer useful, you're a loose end. You gave them the key. You helped them frame Alara. You compromised my entire network." He let the charges hang in the cold air. "But you have one chance. You tell us everything and you help us fix this. You do that, and I will get you out of the country. I will give you a new life where they can never find you. You refuse, and I'll leave you to them." It was a brilliant move. He wasn't offering forgiveness. He was offering escape, the one thing a cornered animal truly wants. Quinn's story came out in a series of ragged, desperate sobs. "It was my mom," he choked out. "She had a student loan from years ago, a small one, but she defaulted when she got sick. It got bought up by a collections agency, Shoreline Servicers." My heart stopped. "They found me," he continued, his voice cracking. "They told me they'd garnish her disability checks, take her house. They knew I worked for you. They said if I just cooperated, they'd mark the debt as paid. I never met Pike. I never met OUI. It was always just them, the men from Shoreline. They put a flag on me. They said I had to comply." He looked at me then, his face a mask of misery and shame. "I'm so sorry. Alara, I didn't want to. They made me." I looked at his tear-streaked face, at the raw terror in his eyes, and I didn't feel the hot, satisfying burn of anger. I didn't feel hatred. All I felt was a profound, weary sadness. I saw myself, just a week ago, backed into the same corner by the same people, my own life being dismantled piece by piece. Quinn wasn't a traitor. He was a victim. He was a casualty of a system that grinds people under its heel. He had made a different choice than I had, a weaker one, but he had been put in the same impossible position. "He's a tool," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Every head in the room turned to me. "He's not the weapon. He's just the mechanism. They used his fear to pull the trigger. We need the people holding the gun." I looked at Dorian. "Don't send him away. Use him. They think he's their asset. Let's make him ours. Let's let him be our way inside." Dorian studied me for a long, silent moment. His face was unreadable, but I saw in his eyes a weighing, a calculation. He was seeing me not as the woman he'd held last night, but as the partner on the ID card. He was seeing the strategist. He gave a single, decisive nod. "We do it your way." The new plan was born in the ruins of the old one, forged from betrayal and desperation. It was simple, and it was elegant. Quinn would contact his Shoreline handler. He would tell them that his access was about to be revoked, but that he had managed to copy the master key, the source code for Alderstone's entire encrypted mesh network, a prize OUI couldn't possibly resist. He would arrange a handover. The location for the handover would be the one place they felt completely safe, the newly renovated, OUI-funded North Point Civic Center. But the drive Quinn would hand over wouldn't contain our source code. It would contain a gift from Arclight, a beautifully designed Trojan horse. The moment they plugged it into their secure, off-network server, it wouldn't try to steal their data. It wouldn't try to destroy anything. It would do something much more elegant. It would turn their server into a mirror. It would broadcast a perfect real-time copy of every file, every illicit transaction, every doctored 911 log, and every name on Pike's payroll, directly to us. We weren't going to break down their door. Quinn was going to open it for us from the inside. The plan had changed. It had changed in the cold, gray light of the church when Quinn Belov had dissolved into a puddle of terrified, hiccuping sobs. He was a brilliant coder, but he was a terrible actor, sending him into the North Point Civic Center. The heart of OUI's power would be a death sentence. They would read the guilt and fear radiating from him in waves. So I made the argument. I was the one they had publicly crucified. I was the rogue dispatcher, the face of the Alderstone conspiracy. If I walked in there, I wouldn't be a terrified coder. I'd be the public enemy, finally defeated, coming in to offer a trade, my life, my freedom, in exchange for the one thing I had left to bargain with the master key to Dorian's network. It was a narrative they would want to believe. It was an act of surrender. Dorian had hated it. His opposition was a silent, cold fury that filled the room, but he was a strategist, and he knew I was right. My public profile made me the perfect Trojan horse. Now, I was walking toward the North Point Civic Center, and my heart was a hummingbird trapped in my chest. The building wasn't a dark, ominous fortress. It was a monument to bureaucratic sterility, all white stone, gleaming glass, and polished steel, reflecting the watery Washington sky. It was aggressively, terrifyingly normal. I felt naked, exposed. My only armor was a plain gray blazer, a white blouse, and a rice grain earpiece, smaller than a tic-tac, nestled deep in my ear. On the other end of that invisible thread was Lena, monitoring my vitals from a new, mobile command center, and Dorian, monitoring my world from a surveillance van parked 2 blocks away. "Comms check, Ilara," Lena's voice whispered, a tiny ghost in my head. I pressed the transmit button, a tiny disc taped to my index finger, hidden under a Band-Aid. "Clear," I murmured, my voice as steady as if I were taking a 911 call. "Keep it calm. Keep it flat. You are the eye of the storm." I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was vast, white, and silent. Smelling of industrial cleaner and new carpet, the acoustics were so perfect that the click of my sensible heels on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. High definition, wide-angle cameras stared down from every corner, their dark lenses reflecting my approach. I was a single, small pawn on a massive white chessboard. 2 security guards in friendly, light blue blazers stood at a polished white desk. They smiled as I approached, not the hard, assessing smiles of cops, but the bright, manufactured smiles of hotel concierges. "Good morning," the closer one said, his name tag reading Chad. "How can we help you?" "I'm here to see Marin Lutz," I said, my voice steady. "She's expecting me." Chad tapped at his monitor. "And your name?" "Ilara North." His fingers paused. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes went flat and cold for a fraction of a second. He'd seen the memo. He knew exactly who I was. Of course. "Miss North, she's been notified." A moment later, a door hissed open, and she appeared. Marin Lutz, the woman from the news, the face of OUI. In person, she was smaller, sharper. She wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, and her smile was a weapon of mass distraction, all teeth and practiced sincerity. "Miss North," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her skin cold. "Thank you for coming in. We're so glad you decided to cooperate. We're all just working toward the same goal here, community safety and integrity." The hypocrisy of it was a physical force, making me want to recoil. I fought the urge. I handed her the prop I'd brought, a thin folder. "This is just a volunteer application," I said, playing the part of the defeated, desperate girl. I just wanted to show I'm serious about making this right, and I brought what Quinn said you needed." I unzipped my satchel and pulled out the clean drive. It was a simple, silver external hard drive. It looked harmless. It looked like a trade. Lutz's eyes lit up, a quick, hungry flash she couldn't hide. She took the drive from my hand. "Excellent. You've made a wise choice. Ilara." She signed a pre-printed receipt, a prop for my benefit, to make this feel like a legitimate transaction, and handed the drive to a waiting technician in a white polo shirt. "Please take this directly to the server room. We need to validate the files immediately." The tech nodded and disappeared through a set of secure doors. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. This was the moment. The tech was walking down a hall. He was swiping a keycard. He was entering the secure room. "Why don't you wait over here?" Lutz gestured to a set of uncomfortable-looking white chairs. I sat on the edge of one, my posture deliberately submissive, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I was now just a girl in a lobby, waiting, but in my ear, the world was exploding. "He's in the server room," Lena whispered. "He's plugging it in. Stand by?" I stared at an abstract, artless painting on the wall, focusing on my breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. I knew Dorian was watching a feed from one of the street cameras. I pictured him in the dark van, perfectly still, his hand resting on his right wrist, a habit I'd noticed, something he did to keep his hands from reacting, to force himself to wait, to stop himself from intervening too soon. The thought of his stillness, his control, kept me grounded. "We're in," Lena said, her voice sharp with triumph. "The mirror is active, cold arc established, the data is flowing. My God, Ilara, it's all here." On my lap, I had a thin tablet hidden inside the volunteer folder. I angled it away from the guards and woke the screen. It wasn't a form, it was a secure terminal, and it was filling with mirrored data from OUI's server in real time. It was a waterfall of corruption, fake invoices for donated medical supplies that matched the exact shipping containers I had tracked, maps of the 911 diversion routes, far more detailed than I'd ever seen, donor lists for the Harrogate Civic League, cross-referenced with city contracts. They weren't just washing money, they were stealing the city blind, all under the guise of public service. And then I saw it. My breath hitched, a tiny, sharp gasp I couldn't hold back. It was a subledger, a list of consulting fees, and a name, Michael Vance, my old supervisor, a payment of $5,000, transferred 2 days after I'd altered that log for him. Another $10,000, paid the day I was publicly suspended. He hadn't just been pressured, he'd been on their payroll from the beginning. He had sacrificed me, his own intern, for a paycheck. The betrayal was so specific, so personal, it cut deeper than anything else. My hand, the one with the transmitter, was shaking. I clenched it into a fist, acknowledged. "Arclight," I whispered, my voice thick. "We have enough. We have more than enough." "Copy that," Lena said. "We're pulling the core files now. Another 30 seconds. Miss North." I looked up. Marin Lutz was standing over me, her smile gone. Her phone was pressed to her ear. Her face, which had been a mask of smooth PR, was now pale and tight with genuine panic. "What do you mean, abnormal outbound traffic?" she hissed into the phone. "What firewall? What?" Someone is poking at our firewall." My blood turned to ice. We'd been too clean. The sudden, massive data mirror had triggered an automated security alert. The 2 concierge guards, Chad and his partner, dropped their smiles. They straightened up, their hands moving to their hips, to the hard, concealed shapes beneath their blazers. Their entire demeanor shifted from hotel to paramilitary. They weren't moving toward me. Not yet, but they were repositioning, their eyes scanning the lobby. I was a rat in a white marble trap. I forced my voice to be small, confused. I stood up, holding my ridiculous folder. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I was just dropping off my application. Is everything okay? I can come back later." It was the perfect distraction. It broke her focus. She looked at me, annoyed, swatting away a fly in the middle of a crisis. "What? No, just stay there." But I was already moving toward the door, forcing a look of polite panic. No, I'm sorry to intrude. I can see you're busy. I'll just go." "Ilara, extract." Dorian's voice. One word, not a suggestion, a command. It cut through my fear like a hot knife. I stopped playing a role. I turned and walked, fast and purposeful, toward the revolving doors. "Ma'am, wait," one of the guards called out, taking a step toward me. I didn't look back. I didn't run. I walked, just like I was late for a bus, pushing my way into the revolving door. The lobby was in chaos behind me. Lutz shouting into her phone, the guards moving toward the server room. They were focused on the internal breach, not the delivery girl who had just left. The door spun me out onto the sidewalk, into the cold, bright, drizzly air. I gasped, my lungs burning. A hand, strong and warm, clamped down on my elbow. I didn't even have to look. The solid grip, the sudden, unshakable stability, the faint, clean scent of cedar and rain. It was Dorian. He had materialized from the street. Just one more man in a dark coat, his face set in a mask of calm. "Keep walking," he murmured, his voice a low vibration next to my ear. He didn't pull me, he just steered me, absorbing my tremors, lending me his strength. We walked half a block, blending into the sparse foot traffic. We turned the corner, out of sight of the North Point lobby. And then, faint but clear, we heard it the high, piercing, internal shriek of the building's alarms. We didn't look back. We didn't run. We just walked, side by side, as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. They had the data, but they had no idea that the ghost they were hunting was already half a mile away, holding the mirror that reflected all their sins. We didn't go back to the loft. We didn't sleep. The adrenaline from the North Point infiltration was a high-frequency current thrumming under my skin, making rest impossible. We went to the new ArcLight mobile hub, a reinforced shipping container hidden in plain sight on Pier 9, its interior a cold, humming brain of servers and blinking lights. Lena and her team were already deep in the data, their faces illuminated by the glowing cascade of files we had mirrored from OUI's server. It was a digital torrent of corruption, and we had it all. "It's done," Lena finally said, hours later, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. The first pale, watery light of dawn was beginning to stain the sky. "The core data is backed up, 9 secure servers, 3 continents. Even if they scrub their entire system, it's too late. We have the receipts." Dorian nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. He and I left the team to their analysis and stepped out into the cold, clean air of the harbor. The port was in that quiet liminal hour between night and day, the air smelling of salt and wet metal. We found ourselves on a high external catwalk, the same steel stairs that led to the loft, overlooking the vast, sleeping yard. He had produced coffee from somewhere, a thermos of black, bitter liquid that burned on the way down. I wrapped my cold hands around the plastic cup, the warmth, a small, grounding comfort. My body was thrumming with a hollow, ringing exhaustion. We had the proof. We had Michael Vance's name on a payroll. We had the real 911 diversion logs. We had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the heavy, silent moment after you pull the pin on a grenade. I stared into the dark liquid, watching the steam curl into the air. I had to ask. I had to know what this all meant. Not for the city, not for OUI, but for him. "Dorian," I said, my voice quiet. He turned his head, his profile a hard, dark line against the pale, emerging light. "When we release this, when the real story breaks, it's going to be a war. Pike, OUI, the city officials they own. They won't just surrender. They'll come after you with everything they have. If this all goes wrong, if they manage to flip this, what do you actually lose?" I expected a short answer. The company, the money, the port. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dark, churning water below. "I lose this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the cranes, the ships, the warehouses. "I lose Alderstone. I lose the leverage, the buildings, the contracts, the offshore accounts, everything I've built for 20 years. He paused, then turned to face me. The intensity in his eyes was a physical force, pinning me in place. But those are just things. Alara, they're tools. They're a fortress. The fortress can be rebuilt. He held my gaze, and the world seemed to narrow to the few inches between us. My people are not replaceable. My breath caught in my throat. If I keep my people safe, he finished, his voice unwavering, I lose nothing. My people. The words echoed in the space between us. It wasn't the sterile, corporate, my team or my employees. It was possessive. It was primal. It was the language of a man who didn't just employ people, but who claimed them. It was Lena and her team. It was the men who had appeared in the diner. It was the man he'd saved at the fence. And I knew, with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity that was equal parts terrifying and deeply, profoundly comforting, it was me. I wasn't just an asset. I wasn't just a partner on a plastic ID card. I was one of his people. To be so completely included in that small, protected circle. It made my heart feel both shielded and perilously exposed. I was no longer an intern, no longer a ghost in the foster system. I was his. The thought was a weight and a warmth all at once, as if the gravity of the moment had summoned it. His phone, resting on the steel rail between us, vibrated. Not a call, a text from an encrypted anonymous number. He picked it up. I watched his face as he read it, saw the last vestiges of the night's weariness vanish, replaced by a cold, hard, strategic focus. The mask was back. He didn't hide the screen. He turned it so I could see. The message was short. Pier 3, sunrise. Just you and me. Let's parley. Bring the dispatcher, or the original file goes public. The words hung in the cold air. Original file, I whispered. Not the audio, Dorian said, his voice a low growl. Something worse. When Shoreline first roped Quinn in, they didn't just ask for a key. They forced him to prove his worth. They made him write the original malware script and run a test on a closed Alderstone server. He looked at me, his eyes cold with rage. They recorded it all. His screen, his keystrokes, the logs. It's a raw file showing my network, my asset, creating the 911 Ghost exploit. It's the one piece of evidence that makes me the author of the entire crime, with or without OUI. He's had this trump card all along. Pier 3 inches, I said, my dispatcher's mind clicking. That's a dead zone. It's where that transformer station exploded last year. The whole pier is off the grid. No city cameras, no power. It's not a parley, Dorian stated, turning to look toward the dark, skeletal outline of the abandoned pier in the distance. It's an ambush, and he knows I have to go. He pocketed the phone and looked at me, his expression flat and absolute. The commander. You will not be there. Lena will take you to the secondary site. Now. I didn't move. The girl who had trembled in the dispatch center, the girl who had flinched at every raised voice, was gone. She'd been burned away in the last week. No, I said. His eyes narrowed. Ilara, that is not a request. I don't care, I said, my voice as steady and cold as his. I stepped in front of him, blocking his view, forcing him to see me. You're not listening. Dorian, he didn't say bring the file. He said, bring the dispatcher. I'm not just a witness anymore. I'm the ransom. I'm the prize. My name is all over this. My voice is on that fake news report. My supervisor's betrayal is tied to me. I jabbed a finger at my own chest. If I hide, if I run while you go to that pier, they win. They'll say you silenced me, or they'll paint me as the tragic, corrupted victim. But if I am there, if I walk onto that pier, I'm not a pawn anymore. I'm a player. I'm the one who saw the data. I'm the one who can testify. If I don't face him with you, they will always use my name to bring you down. I will not be your weakness. He stared at me for a long, silent beat. The wind was picking up, cold and sharp, whipping my hair across my face. He wasn't looking at a liability. He was seeing the steel he had helped forge. He saw I was right. He reached out, not in anger, but slowly. He took both of my cold hands in his grip strong and warm, enveloping me. He pulled me closer until his forehead was resting against mine. We stood there, toe to toe, breathing the same cold air, our eyes locked. The smell of cedar and bitter coffee was all I could breathe. "This will be the hardest thing you have ever done," he whispered, his voice rough, not with command, but with a raw, strained emotion. "It will be chaos. Alara, when it breaks, and it will break, I need a promise from you." His grip tightened. There was a green beacon on the west gantry, the emergency light for the harbor channel. If I tell you to run, if things go wrong, you run to that light. You don't stop. You don't wait for me. You don't look back. Promise me. I looked into his dark eyes, so close they were all I could see. I saw the fear he was feeling, not for himself, for me. "We haven't looked back since that first night in the diner." "Dorian," I whispered, "I'm not changing my mind now." A muscle in his jaw clenched. He knew I wasn't promising. I was stating a fact. We were in this together. He didn't argue. He just accepted it. And then he kissed me. It was nothing like the slow, healing tenderness of the night before. This was not a kiss of comfort. It was short, hard, and desperate. It was a brutal, fierce collision of lips, a sealing of a pact, a final breath of air before a deep, cold dive. It wasn't about romance. It was about survival. It was a promise. I will see you on the other side. He broke the kiss as quickly as it began, but his hand stayed on mine. He reached into his coat pocket and pressed a small, cold, flat object into my palm. It was a smooth, black, polished stone of a device with a single, recessed button. "The earpiece you wore at North Point," he said, his voice all business again, the strategist back in full control. "It's locked to this. It's a closed loop. Bypasses all radio frequencies, all jammers. If we get separated, if you're in trouble, you press this." I closed my fist around it. The cold, smooth device felt impossibly heavy, a lifeline and a burden. "And you'll hear me," I asked, "even if I can't speak." His eyes held mine, dark and absolute. "I'll hear a word you don't say. I'll hear one word." The wind gusted, a cold, sharp blade coming off the dark water. From the pier below, I heard the rhythmic, hollow thud, thud, thud of a loose buoy knocking against the wooden pilings. It sounded exactly like a heart, beating faster and faster in the dark. Sunrise was in less than an hour. Pier 3 was a skeleton. The wooden planks under our feet were slick with a fine, greasy mist, and the air was thick with the smell of decay, creosote, and stagnant water. There was no light, no sound, just the vast, oppressive darkness of the abandoned pier stretching out into the black water. We walked in perfect sync, two shadows moving through a dead space. My hand was clenched around the smooth, cold device in my pocket, my thumb resting on the single, recessed button. We reached the midway point, a wide, open space where a cargo shed had once stood. We stopped. The silence was absolute. Then, with a loud, humming buzz, the world exploded into light. A bank of harsh, orange sodium lamps flickered to life on the roof of the warehouse behind us, casting our long, sharp shadows across the pier. It was a stage, and we were the actors, pinned in the spotlight. Pike had a flair for the dramatic. He stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by the two brutish thugs from Shoreline Servicers, and behind them, a dozen men in dark tactical gear with the subtle, insidious OUI insignia on their sleeves. Pike himself looked immaculate, his suit uncreased, his smile a thin, predatory slash. "Dorian too," he called out, his voice echoing in the sudden, artificial light. "Always a pleasure, and you brought the help." His eyes, cold and empty, landed on me, the famous dispatcher, the ghost in the machine. He held up a small, blood-red USB drive. "The original sin, Dorian, your pet coder, Quinn Belov, building the malware that started it all, a beautiful little piece of evidence. And over there. He gestured with the drive toward the shore. We have the press, a few choice bloggers, ready to get the real story out, along with a few friends from the Ardmore PD, who are on their way to arrest a known criminal for racketeering. Dorian didn't move. He stood, a pillar of calm in the center of the storm. What's the trade? Eamon? Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The trade? Oh, there's no trade. He tossed the red USB from hand to hand. I don't need your network. I don't need your money. I have the city now. I have OUI. I have everything. The trade is simpler. He pointed the drive at Dorian, then at me. I want you, and I want her. My blood ran cold. It wasn't about the data. It was never about the data. It was about the narrative. They needed to destroy the legend of Dorian Lazaro. They needed to discredit the private justice he represented. And they needed to make an example of the girl who had dared to call him. They needed to erase us. As if on cue, I heard it, faint but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of approaching sirens, the APD, coming to be the final piece of Pike's stage play. I looked at Dorian. Our eyes met. He didn't speak. He just gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The signal. It's time. Change the plan. The dispatcher inside me took over. The fear was a distant hum, the adrenaline a cold, clear focus. I took a step forward into the center of the light, my voice ringing out, clear and steady, loud enough for any hidden microphone to catch every word. My name is Alara North. Pike's smile faltered, his men tensed. That USB drive in your hand, I continued, my voice gaining strength, is a fabrication, a piece of a story you invented. The real story, the OUI slush fund, the Harrogate payroll, the doctored 911 logs, the name of every corrupt official on your payroll has already been delivered to 9 independent journalists and to 2 state senators who do not like being lied to. Panic flashed in Pike's eyes. He had lost control of the narrative. Get her, he snarled at his men. The OUI team started to move, and the world went black. With a loud pop, every sodium lamp on the pier died. Arclight, from a safe distance, had just borrowed all the power from the city's water treatment plant. We were plunged into a darkness so complete it was disorienting. In the sudden, absolute black, I heard movement, a whisper of cloth, a grunt of surprise. Dorian was a ghost, a phantom moving through the chaos. I heard a short, brutal struggle, the clatter of a weapon on the wooden planks. Then, a blinding blue-white flash lit up the pier for a split second, etching the scene onto my retinas. Pike was standing by a large, rusted breaker box on a pole, a pair of insulated cutters in his hand. He had triggered a dead man's switch, a booby trap, sending a massive electrical surge through the wet, metal-plated surface of the pier. The surge caught Dorian mid-stride. I saw his body convulse, a silent, violent arc, and he went down, landing hard on one knee with a pained, guttural cry that was stolen by the darkness. Run to the green light, don't look back. His promise, his command. I ignored it. I didn't run away. I ran to him. My feet slipped on the wet, treacherous wood. I slid the last few feet on my knees, the rough planks tearing at my jeans. I smelled the sharp, acrid scent of ozone, of burned electricity. I grabbed the front of his coat, my hands clumsy in the dark. Dorian. Get back, he gasped, his voice strained with pain. No, I pulled with all my strength, my feet finding purchase. He was a dead weight. I felt something sharp slice into the palm of my hand, a piece of exposed metal on the deck, but I didn't let go. I dragged him, scraping and pulling, out of the slick, puddled water that was still crackling with residual current. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, pinning us. It was Pike. He was 10 feet away, a gun in his hand, the beam perfectly steady. How touching, he sneered. The hero and his little dispatcher? This ending is even better. He raised the gun. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My hand, the one that wasn't bleeding, fumbled in my pocket. My fingers found the smooth, cold device. My thumb found the button. My voice was gone. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. I could only breathe. Ragged, shallow, terrified gasps into the silent, open channel. My thumb pressed down. Click. And in my earpiece, a tiny, tinny speaker, Dorian heard a word, not from me, a pre-recorded word, triggered by my signal, spoken in his own voice, a single, clear, calm command. Live? As if that word was a detonator, the entire shoreline erupted. With a roar, a dozen massive, blinding floodlights from the roofs of Alderstone trucks parked along the waterfront snapped on, turning the dark pier into a stage brighter than noon. Pike and his men, caught in the sudden, overwhelming glare, threw their hands up, momentarily blinded. The port workers who had been milling about on the shore were not workers. They were 100 strong, a disciplined civilian force emerging from the shadows, all wearing Alderstone security jackets, and behind them, pulling up not with sirens, but with cameras rolling, were 2 official APD patrol cars, the ones the journalists had brought with them. Pike was trapped. The ambush had been turned inside out. He was the one on the stage now. And then, the final checkmate. From the mobile command center, Quinn Belov, the boy they had tried to break, hit enter. Across the city, on public access channels, on news station websites, on every hijacked digital billboard in Ardmore Harbor, the data began to stream. The OUI logo appeared, then dissolved, replaced by a live feed of their own secret ledgers, the money laundering, the ghost payrolls, Michael Vance's name next to his payoffs, the real 911 diversion logs. It was all there for the entire city to see. The OUI tactical team, their faces illuminated by the floodlights, looked at each other, then at the undeniable proof being broadcast to the world. Their comms were likely screaming with orders to retreat. They began to back away, melting into the shadows, abandoning Pike to his fate. Pike saw it all, the cameras, the civilian force, his own men deserting him. He was no longer a king. He was just a man in a suit, standing on a pier, with nowhere left to run. Dorian, leaning on me for support, slowly, painfully, got to his feet. He had a long, bleeding gash on his arm, and he was favoring his leg, but he stood tall. He put one arm around my waist, holding me close, and with his other, he took my bleeding hand. He didn't have to give an order. He didn't have to say a word. The port, the lights, the cameras, they were all his. In the chaos, Pike made a desperate run for it, but the shoreline thugs, seeing their boss abandoned and the entire operation collapsing, were not loyal. They were survivors. They tackled him before he got 10 feet, hoping to cut a deal. On the pier, under the warm, bright glare of the floodlights, the world finally went quiet. The sirens were off. The shouting had stopped. There was only the sound of the water lapping against the pilings and the steady, reassuring beat of my own heart. Finally slowing. Dorian leaned in close, his lips brushing against my damp hair. His voice was a low, rough whisper, meant only for me. "The first time you called," he murmured, "I told you to come. From now on, if you tell me to stay, I will stay." I looked out at the dark water, at the first faint hint of pink and gold on the horizon. I thought of the long, lonely nights, the foster homes, the constant feeling of being a ghost in my own life. I thought of the terror, the betrayal, and the impossible. Terrifying choices. And I thought of the man standing beside me, the anchor who had held me steady through the storm. I turned my head, my cheek brushing against the rough wool of his coat. I looked up at him, and I gave him my answer. One word, a promise, a beginning. Stay. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Mafia Boss Stories. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.